Okay, so my name is Ethan, and I am with the Seattle Ananda Sangha. And today we're going to be doing an edition of Sangha Stories, where we interview members of the Sangha, um, so that people in the future who may be interested can listen to how we lived at Ananda, how we came to Ananda, and who we are. Today we'll be talking to Jamuna, Nayaswami Jamuna, who is a very long time member of the Ananda Sangha. Jamuna, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So the first question we'll start out with is, how were you as a kid? What was your upbringing like, spiritually and otherwise?
I was one of four siblings. My father was an intellectual. He was a writer, and he was on his own. He wrote at home. He had his own little office, so he was always there. My mother was a housekeeper until she finally got liberated and went to work at the library across the street, but that was much later. So my parents were a little bit older. Dad was 40 when the twins were born. We were the middle two. Um, and they were very serious and very conscientious about bringing up children. And so it was a very rich experience in that way, and very loving. What else?
Did you guys go to church?
We did. My mother came out of the tradition of the Swedenborgian church, which was a mystical Christian church. So she brought that to the marriage. My dad had taught where they had met. My dad had taught in a school that was Swedenborgian. So he had been introduced to that understanding. But he always said, "I don't really know what I believe. I'll get there on mother's apron strings." That's the way he described his commitment. Mother was very committed, and because we lived away from a church, a Swedenborgian church, we went next door to the Methodist church, and so we did have the experience of Sunday school and the teachings of Christ.
Were you on board with all those? Did it speak to
Yeah,
you?
I was very, very shy, so it was always a big experience to expand my reality. And I remember one time in church when we were my twin sister and I were in a pageant. We were bumblebees, and I was so afraid I just stood there and said nothing, and then ran off and cried. Um, but we memorized things, and we knew the disciples. And so, I mean, it was always interesting as a child. I found it always interesting to expand my knowledge. So, yeah.
Did you have any mystical experiences of your own?
Not that I can remember, but what stands out so clearly in my mind was my mother. At one time, one particular experience, she described, and it's strange how the memory works. I can't remember what her description was, but it was clearly a mystical experience of her own that she had had the the day before. And I remember my response to it was to look up at her and say, "Oh, mother." So I was clearly, reading it and being very deeply affected by
So,
it.
so you observed her having the experience.
No, I observed she was telling us of the
Oh, okay.
experience, and I responded to it with this awe, a sense of awe.
Uh-huh.
So there was something very real communicated there. Mhm.
Mhm. So you had a twin sister. Is she just like you in every way?
No, we're fraternal, and she was my champion. She came out 4 minutes first, and I was very shy and wasn't so sure about being here. She was very sure about being here. She took my hand, and she just took me through a lot of experiences. So,
Yeah.
so she was
Well,
the extrovert.
mm. So as you were growing up, when you became a teenager, did you think more about these things? Was there any point of rebellion or?
Not against the spiritual things. I remember when I was around 16, I was very intrigued by the astral world because Swedenborg spoke of the astral world, and Mother taught us the Swedenborgian teachings aside from our Methodist Sunday school. So that's where my mind was. My mind was on the thought that there was another world we had come from. Swedenborg called this world a world of correspondences. So as above, so below. So everything had a correspondence. The birds represented this spiritually, and different creatures represented that quality spiritually. So that was where my mind was in terms of understanding life.
So then it sounds like you had a somewhat substantial spiritual upbringing as a
Yeah,
child.
I'd say there was a lot of support there. What I found out interestingly later was my older sister did rebel against it all. And she's annoyed at me. She's very annoyed at me for coming into yoga. And she said, I bet you got caught by that yoga stuff because you listened to Mother talk about Swedenborg. So she clearly threw it all away, and she found her way into the Lutheran church, and that became where she served. So that was fine. Although I tried to convince her otherwise, I realized it wasn't fair.
It's a tendency we all have, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
That's all
I
right.
kept sending her all those great books of the yogis talking about the Sermon on the Mount or talking about this, and oh, what a terrible thing to do. I soon saw that it wasn't fair, and I stopped.
Yeah. So how did you come to Ananda then?
My first husband, whom I married in 1970, we happened to read the autobiography at the same time. We read it together, separately together. I don't remember conversing about it, but we probably did.
Just out of coincidence, you did? You ended up doing that? Or?
I don't know. It had to have been a choice somehow, but we read, all I can say is we read the autobiography, and I don't know how it got into our hands. That I can't remember. And he's passed on, so I don't have any reverence for that. But he was the kind of fellow who said, this is what I want. Let's find out where it is. Let's go for it. And I, being more cautious, wouldn't have done that. So I am eternally grateful to him. So he said, I wonder where we can find, and all we could find was the references to Self-Realization Fellowship. But then I remembered that I didn't have the job at the time, but in the previous job as a social worker in San Francisco, where we were, I had sat behind a man who was constantly working on building plans. He wasn't doing his caseload, whereas I was going crazy trying to keep up my caseload. And I said, Tom, what are you doing? And he said, I'm going to build a rammed earth house at this place called Ananda that friends of mine are starting. Well, this was many years later, maybe 2, 3, 4 years later, probably 3 years later. I said to my husband, wait a minute, I think I still have Tom's phone number in my address book back in those days. I called him up that night. He came over and talked to us in our living room for about 4 hours. He was leaving the next morning to drive to Ananda. So what an interesting way God put that all together. So he said to us, and there were 2 children. My first husband had 2 children. His wife had died. He said, when you come up, just park on my building site, and that's where you can stay. And so it took us a year and a half to raise the money. There was a fee for applying to Ananda. We bought a bread van, and we outfitted it, and we had a car, and we just put those 2 together, and we went to Ananda a year and a half later. And I arrived there, I think it was May of 71. I think it was 71. Yeah.
And that was at Ananda Village?
That was when it was at the meditation retreat. The village was starting, but where they put newcomers, once they said, yes, you can be a member, they put us up at the retreat because there was more connectivity up there and more happening. And that's where Swami was functioning from. And the kids integrated well. They found their way. And made their friends, and yeah, so it worked. And we lived out of the bread van and on a long road where there were lots of people all along the road. It was called Sunset Boulevard, and there were tents and bread vans all along that road. And yeah, there we were.
So you were there basically at the very start.
It was, well, it started in 69, so this was 71. And actually, Asha Praver, who wrote the book, The Light Bearer, about Swami decade by decade, she mentions that Swami asked her to run the retreat kitchen and become the head cook.
Yeah.
Well, one weekend she had to go away, and so she asked Parvati and me to run the kitchen for her. And that's where I became friends. Those two ladies are dear friends to this day. I started working for Asha in the kitchen. Yeah, so that was in the beginning.
And you have a story about doing the dishes in the kitchen, don't you?
My memory, I don't know about a story about doing the dishes, but one of my memories was an absolutely glorious Easter when there were so many dishes. Oh my gosh, there was just so much to clean up. And we just had a wonderful time. We sang, we put chants on the I guess there was a cassette player, and we just worked for hours, and it was just exactly what we wanted to be doing. It wasn't hard work. It wasn't that we wanted to be doing anything else, because we were all together and we were enjoying the joy. Yeah.
So when you say that, the question has to follow, was that always the case for you, that when hard work came, it was just always, or was that new for you, a new experience that you could do hard work happily?
I think that was in line with my life. My father was very keen about contributing to the welfare of all, and so this was ideal. Now, my dad was not happy that I was there. Neither of my parents were happy that I was there. They questioned it a lot, and I just said, this is the right place for me. It wasn't until later in 1979, when I lived in the Ananda house in San Francisco, one of the first attempts at urban Ananda. Mm-hmm. And my dad wrote to me and said, who is that man from Scarsdale? His reference to Swamiji. Who is that man from Scarsdale? And what are you going to do if you can't pay the rent? And, good father questions, very good father questions. And I showed Swami the letter, actually, because he was in the house at the time. And he said, I want you now not to just brush this off. I want you to write your parents and tell them exactly why you're with us and what it means to you. And when I wrote that letter to my father, his response was, you have made a legitimate choice. It's not my choice, but it's a legitimate choice. And that meant a lot to me. That really meant a lot to me. But initially, I was, and probably am to this day, with a few of us left, black sheep of the family, because, hey, I was in California. I was choosing. My dad came to visit Ananda, and he said, it reminds me of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. So, what was this daughter doing, throwing away her education?
Yeah. Well, I want to talk to about LA in a minute. You had mentioned that as you were looking for, after you had read the autobiography and your husband had wanted to find more, that you guys had come across SRF. Was there any debate about whether to join SRF or Ananda? Or
no, we actually hadn't yet contacted. It was when I got the flash that Tom's phone number was in my book that went out the window. It was going to be going this way.
So Ananda is just what came to you.
It just came to me. It was, yeah. And I mean, God was watching over, as he does for all of us, if we can get it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great.
So tell us about your move from the village or the meditation retreat to LA. How did that come about?
No, it wasn't LA. It was San Francisco.
Oh, San Francisco. Okay.
What happened was we probably only stayed in the village for the hottest summer. I think that summer of 71 was 106 degrees. And we left the second week in December, and the snow was probably 2 feet deep. So we had an experience of extremities, which they don't, well, weather's changing now, but that didn't always stay that extreme. Part of it was the family was just going in different directions. We had put the children who were 8 and 6, we had put them in the little school in what's that little town called next to Ananda? North San Juan. We put them in a school there, in Columbia up the other side of the street. But they were, I don't know whether this was the right thing for them, and our marriage was not surviving, and so everything was pulling apart personally. So we went back to San Francisco, and my commitment was to Ananda. I knew it. My husband was not so clear about it, and so I started a meditation group in my home, and then the divorce came through, and then I continued to connect with Ananda as more and more people started visiting and coming down and doing book fairs and stuff, and trying to see if urban communities could happen. And eventually, when I was on my own again, Davy said, it's time for you to move and have an ashram experience. And that's when I moved to the Ananda House in 1976, I think it was 1976. And so from there was when, on a visit by Swamiji and an offer by the lady who owned the bookstore in Menlo Park called East West Bookshop, she had for a second time offered it to Swamiji, and he was interested in getting a bookstore started in San Francisco. So there was lots of talk at the ashram, and I thought, well, where are the books going to come from? How are we going to be doing this? And everyone said, well, we'll take those books that don't sell from Menlo Park, and we'll start a little store in San Francisco, and then we'll beef it up from there. Well, I thought that business plan, it's the only time I ever thought about a business plan, was crazy. So I stayed out of those negotiations. I wouldn't go and talk about East West Bookshop in San Francisco. And one day I walk into the kitchen in the ashram, and somebody in that kitchen said, Swami wonders if you'd be willing to run the bookstore. And that was meaning San Francisco. And I said yes. I mean, God said, I did not say, God said yes. And I go, what are you doing? And the minute that news got to Swamiji, he called me and he said, would you be willing not to do the San Francisco thing? Yay! But do Menlo Park. And I had just said yes to Vasudeva. He and I had connected. So it was 3 yeses in a row that got me into that bookstore and into the heart of Ananda. That's when I really stepped in. And so we got married in December of 1980. And I became manager of the bookstore in Menlo Park in January of 81.
So was that already an established bookstore?
It was. It had been there for 15 years. It was a very unique bookstore for its time because there weren't all the middlemen that were created after that. The decades after that, you got all the book people and all that stuff. A lot of what she had done, Virginia Sharfman had bought from booksellers all over the world. She had a global metaphysical bookstore. People would come in there from everywhere to find books that they couldn't find anywhere else. And I remember one time hearing a customer say, here it is, the red book I've been looking for years. I'm sure you had that experience probably in your bookstore, but it was so much fun. Treasures.
So East West, it was already called East West at that time.
Yeah.
Right?
Good name.
Yes. How did you, I guess this is more of a personal question because people watching this may know I've also taken my turn a little bit at East West as in its incarnation in Seattle. What was it like for you to be in a bookstore of all these other faiths and practices, and having your own. What was there any?
Well, I soon recognized that what had happened for me, I had had little doorways as I trundled along the path. One of my doorways was the Catholic saints. I read all the Teresas, and I would think, oh my gosh, couldn't I have an experience like that? And in the Catholic perspective was, these are special people and this isn't
Right.
for you. And that's why when I read autobiography, it was like, oh my gosh, I can do this too. So I had that doorway. Reading Carl Jung was another doorway, insightful doorway for me. So I realized early on that when I went down there and had no idea what a tarot card was, but I realized that was a doorway, and it was all right. I could. The other thing I learned pretty quickly is I was thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to advise people on making choices in areas that I had nothing to say about? I mean, I did not know metaphysics. I knew spirituality, but I didn't know metaphysics. So I early on learned that what I was going to be was just, I would stand there with them at the tarot bookshelf, and I would engage them in a conversation. And in a certain way, it just happened. You would be urging them to use their intuition at what tarot card was right for them. And sometimes it would start with, what about this one? And they'd say no. Well, that was perfect. That was a perfect way for that dialogue to start. And then I'd say, you know better. What do you think? And then they'd choose what. And I didn't feel bad because I had the doorway idea. That was my way of working with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So at some point, then you got asked to. I imagine you got asked to come to Seattle.
Yes, well, but what happened first was that
Okay.
I had to figure out why in the world Swamiji had asked me to manage this bookstore when I had a very strong-minded husband at my side. And he wanted me to learn how to be manager. And that was a real challenge. And I had 6 months to try it out on my own. And then he said to Vasudeva, why don't you go join your wife in the bookstore? Again, I reflect on Swami's genius, because I think it was the making of the marriage. He was a very strong person, and we had this thing together between us. We had it, instead of the relationship going this way, the relationship was going this way, which with God as your pole star, of course, but with the management of the bookstore as our way of learning how to do that, made it happen. It was fiery at times, and I had to figure out how to be strong in learning leadership, but also learning cooperative leadership, and also allowing the natural process of Voss's unbelievable talents in this area, which he was discovering and I was discovering, and let it become the mom and pop kind of combination that it truly was. So it was a very interesting process.
So it started out with you. You were there, the only manager to start.
I was the manager, and I took over. Ananda had been in charge of the store from May to January when I came, but they had a mixed staff of the old bookstore staff and some new Ananda people. But they didn't know how to manage it at all. Everything was, I knew already common sense wise that things were not working well, and they were losing tons of money. So I straightened out, believe it or not, I straightened out the finances of the store just through common sense. Like, you pay back your donors. You don't leave them hanging for half a year. Thank you. I mean, those kinds of things seem common sense to me rather than business expertise. But I got that going. And then Voss had an incredible sense of money. Very, very intuitive about money, and very, very intuitive about book buying. So that combination with my mothering made it work.
So in a way, we've sort of skipped something or taken it for granted. How did you come to take Swami's advice and live by it? I mean, to go to start a new job because someone
Yeah.
else asks you isn't
Yeah.
trivial for most people.
No, I had seen Swami Kriyananda for the first time in San Francisco when I was a social worker. Tom, the man I talked to you about, took me to see Swami standing on his head at the Oddfellows Hall in San Francisco.
Literally
And that was
standing on
my
his head.
he was doing yoga postures.
Yeah.
And that was my first meeting. Then I met him, at the village, and I was very struck by his trustworthiness, his integrity. There was just something, his dynamic joy, I guess, as I would understand that now. I just, for some reason, I absolutely trusted him. And I was tested in living in San Francisco. I once had a lady from Self-Realization who told me I was in real trouble following that Kriyananda fellow. And she I burst out crying when she was lecturing me. And I said, I think you can leave now. She was in my living room. And I just meditated on it. And I said, look, the question to me is he trustworthy? Can I trust my sense of it? And I could. And I said, I'm standing against anyone who's trying to take me away from his leadership. This is my destiny. I can feel it. I know it. This is where I belong. So that relationship, and Swamiji and I had an interesting relationship. He was always, as he is with each of us, people would say, why isn't Jacqueline coming back to Ananda? Why isn't Jacqueline doing this? Why isn't she this? And one time in the car, someone they were really taunting me. Swamiji, why isn't Jacqueline back at the village? And Swami said to her, she'll come back when we have a library. Just because I was a librarian. Anyway, he was very gracious and kept at it, so that, I met him in 71. It was 1980 when he asked me to do the bookstore. That was a long-standing relationship, and he hung in there with me, and I'm very grateful for that.
So then how did you come to Seattle?
What was happening was the staff in Seattle was shifting, and Nivriti was going to go to the village, and she was one of the founders of the bookstore and one of the managers of the bookstore. And so they really needed another manager. And they simply asked Palo Alto. Those days, now we don't borrow from other colonies, but those years we borrowed from each other. And so they asked in Palo Alto if we could come for Voss to help Susan. And I had already shifted over into the church office, which is another interesting thing, but we don't need to get into that, how you know when you're finished with something. But anyway, and Voss and Asha was very reluctant to let us go, but there were things going on that seemed it seemed right to make that decision. So she said, you can take a few days to decide. Well, before Voss and I even got the key in the door at our home, we said, yeah, we're going to go. So it was just like that. We were asked and we said yes. And so we came up in February of 96. And then there was an earthquake. And we went, oh my God, we thought we got away from earthquakes in California.
Yeah. So I remember you and I used to talk a lot, or I used to talk to you a lot, or one way or the other when I was.
I've known Ethan since he was 6 years old.
Yeah.
That's your mom said she brought you to the church when you were 6 years old. And I did some Sunday school.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So you were already working at the temple at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Were you doing both East, West, and temple work at the same time?
No, there was a period of time when I was asked to work with Susan, and it was in 2005, I think. So I did some shifts back at the bookstore just to help out. And it's always a place in my heart to be at a bookstore. So yeah, but I was always officially with the church since '94. So Palo Alto for 2 years and then up here.
In fact, you're still taking some shifts at the bookstore to this day, are you?
Oh, this is the lovely thing. Yeah, with the bookstore now at the church temple, and there needs to be a sort of a floating staff. I'm taking a Saturday shift at East West, and it just feels like home. I love it. You know, well, that's what Swami said to me. He said, you love books and you love people, so you can put it together. And because in a library, I go, oh my gosh, I'm going to sell books, not just give them away.
Yeah.
He said, you'll get used to it. Yeah. So yeah, and so it continues, and I love doing the East-West thing, because you're handing people books that could very well change their lives, right?
Yeah. So at some point, I don't know when, you changed your name from Jacqueline, which is how I met you, to Jamuna.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
A lot of people were asking Swamiji for names, and I just didn't feel any aversion to Jacqueline. I enjoyed that name. My mother was a Francophile, and somehow I got the genes, and I've always loved French things. So it was just a good match. But people said, why don't you ask Swami for a name? I said, well, when the time is right, I will. And then finally I did. And I got no answer for about 1.5 years. And I thought, gee, I wonder what this means. So then I checked on his email address, and I had used the wrong one. So it had gone off into oblivion. So I wrote him, I said, Swami, I had the wrong address. And he said, I wonder why I hadn't heard from you. And he immediately in 2008 gave me the name Jamuna, which is related to the Jamuna River, which flows by the Taj Mahal. And he said, getting into the flow, which I think is the quality for you. So I was delighted. It's a beautiful name. I'm really thankful. And changing your name to a spiritual name that someone has, like your spiritual teacher, has chosen for you, is quite an experience. It's really changes your consciousness.
Do you feel that you're no longer Jacqueline?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
I know as I was listening to the tapes of Yogananda speak, he uses the same words that a weird comparison, but the same words that appear in Star Wars when Darth Vader says, I killed Anakin long ago. Yogananda says, I killed Yogananda long ago.
Yes.
Which is actually his spiritual name. He was originally Mukunda. So I thought that was interesting, that people really feel that way, that they've become someone else.
Yeah, you do. I understand it even on the secular level. A lot of people have changed their names because they didn't care for their birth names. But it's another level up, and it really can change consciousness, because that name is always coming towards you. Yeah.
Well, I have there's a few suggested questions here. I have one more to ask you. But before that, is there anything else you wanted to say? We're running out of time here.
I am grateful just about every day. The thought comes across my mind for having found Ananda. How in the world did I get so lucky to do that, and to take it seriously, and to make the choice? I thank all those in this world who supported that and grew me up. I was 33 when I found Ananda, and now I'm approaching my 79th birthday. That's a long time. And so, it's like my whole life, really. And it offers you to step into spiritual communities such as this with the gurus, and a great teacher offers you a meaningful life for your whole life. And for me, there's no such thing as retirement. I still do a lot of teaching and artwork and any way I can to spread the light.
Yeah. What was there any difficulty for you in saying, I don't know, goodbye to a worldly life, or did that ever appeal to you? You know, going out to parties or drinking or dancing or anything like that. Was that ever?
Not really.
Yeah.
Not
Right.
really.
Right.
You know, no,
Yeah.
it's just all one piece.
Yeah. Did you feel like it was a closing of any doors and an opening of others, or was it just only opening?
You know, every once in a while, but Master says not to do this, but we do lapse into every once in a while. I wonder what my life would have been like. I see places where I could have made a different decision and gone in a different way, and I ponder on that. And I wonder what kind of a worldly life I would have had. But I can't see any happiness in it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see it going anywhere. I mean, when I became a Nayaswami in 2009, I thought, this is so wonderful to be given a course, you know, a little course corrective for what is next, what's coming next. Most people don't think about what's coming next at this stage of the game. They think about retiring from what they've already been doing. But we're always thinking forward. What's next? What's the next phase for my life? Um, you can't beat it. Yeah.
So I guess the last question, then perhaps you've just answered it now, but it's when you think about being a disciple, what does that mean to you?
It means staying aware. In other words, it means keeping up the battle between your higher self and your lower inclinations. It means being alert, always ready to make. I mean, I see the work, doing the work, which I talk about a lot when I teach, is doing the inner work, making the changes inwardly. And it's a constant process, and it gets subtler and subtler. And, you know, we're just trying to clean up all the ways in which we've gotten very engaged in this world. And so being a disciple means you have a guide, you have a purpose, you have a destination, and it all makes sense. And then of course all the teachings give you a perspective that you would never get in the world. And it just puts your life on another level, and you're always wanting to be your best for God, not for anybody else, but for God.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, Jamuna. I think that
Thank you, Ethan. And let's talk more.
sure. Yeah. Yes, I don't take you to Saturdays anymore, so we miss that. But
Yeah, I do too.
yeah,
Someday.
yeah, perhaps when this whole COVID thing is over, we can talk more. All right. Well, take
Okay.
care.
Thank you.